The scene is one of pure despair. The small town of Nome, Alaska, with its few thousand inhabitants, was facing the peak of a cruel winter. But the real enemy wasn't the cold or the snowstorm sweeping through the deserted streets. It was diphtheria, a deadly disease spreading rapidly among the children. In January 1925, the doctors of Nome sent an urgent message via telegraph. Help needed. No sufficient serum. Epidemic out of control. The only known cure for diphtheria was an antitoxin serum, but the town's stock was depleted. The response came from the city of Anchorage, where there were sufficient doses available. But how could the serum travel nearly 1,000 kilometers of ice and snow, in temperatures reaching -50 degrees Celsius, when trains couldn't reach the town and airplanes couldn't fly? There was only one option: to rely on sled dogs, the only ones capable of crossing the hostile terrain. Thus began what would be known as the Serum Run, a life-or-death journey to save Nome. Nome was a small, isolated town in Alaska, surrounded by ice, snow, and darkness during the harsh winter of 1925. Surviving on mining and fishing, the population, mostly made up of working families, was accustomed to the extreme challenges of the region. But nothing could prepare them for what was about to unfold. In mid-January, Nome's only doctor, Dr. Curtis Welch, began treating children with strange and alarming symptoms: high fever, difficulty breathing, and bluish discoloration on their lips and extremities. At first, he thought it was just a common flu, but within days, the cases increased, and the symptoms became more severe. When children began dying, Dr. Welch knew for certain it was diphtheria. Diphtheria was highly contagious and deadly, especially among children. It attacked the respiratory system, and without antitoxin, a special serum, the chances of survival were nearly zero. Dr. Welch searched through all the town's medical supplies but found only a few outdated and ineffective doses. He knew that without immediate help, Nome was facing an epidemiological catastrophe. Desperate, Dr. Welch sent a telegraph message to Anchorage, the nearest city with access to the antitoxin. He explained the severity of the situation and pleaded for help. The response arrived quickly. There was a stock of serum in Anchorage, but the greatest challenge was how to transport it to Nome. The winter of 1925 was one of the harshest ever recorded. Temperatures consistently stayed below -40 degrees Celsius, and snowstorms blanketed Alaska, making the use of airplanes or boats impossible. The train was the only viable option for part of the route, but the railroad line ended in Nenana, still nearly 1,000 kilometers from Nome. With time running out and lives at stake, Alaska's authorities decided that the only way to deliver the serum was through sled dog teams, traditionally used for transportation in such inhospitable regions. The operation was organized as a massive relay race. Around 150 dogs and 20 drivers, known as mushers, would complete the journey in stages, each covering a portion of the route to Nome. It was an insane mission, to face snowstorms, treacherous gorges, and frozen rivers, all in one of the most hostile climates in the world. The cargo was simple but vital: a metal cylinder containing about 10 kilograms of antitoxin serum, wrapped in layers of cloth and straw to protect it from freezing. Every second was crucial. The serum needed to be kept at a stable temperature, or it would lose its effectiveness. Among the many mushers called upon was Gunnar Kazan, a calm, experienced man deeply connected to his dogs. His team leader was Balto, a Siberian husky Gunnar always described as exceptionally loyal and intelligent. Despite Balto's physical robustness, many considered him less agile or fast than other, more famous sled dogs. He had never led such an important stage, but Gunnar trusted him completely. Balto was born into a lineage of Siberian huskies known for their strength and endurance. He was a dog of solid build, with thick fur that shimmered under the snow and eyes that seemed to observe the world with intelligence and serenity. Despite his qualities, Balto was often overshadowed by faster and more aggressive sled dogs. For Gunnar, however, Balto's true strength didn't lie in his speed but in his intuition and impeccable obedience. Balto never hesitated, even in dangerous situations, and had an uncommon ability to find hidden paths in the snow, a crucial instinct during storms. Gunnar always said, "He's not just strong. He knows where to go, even when I don't." When the news came that Gunnar would lead the final stretch to Nome, many questioned his choice, and Balto's. Other mushers believed a faster dog would be better for the last stage. But Gunnar stood firm. He knew Balto had something no other dog possessed: the ability to achieve the impossible. Meanwhile, The first mushers were already facing titanic challenges. The storms were so severe that some sled dogs began to collapse from the extreme cold. Other mushers reported trails blocked by accumulated snow, frozen rivers starting to give way, and winds that turned every meter into a struggle for survival. As the relay progressed, the whole world began to follow the Serum Run. Alaska, a region often overlooked by the rest of the country, was now at the center of global attention. Newspapers reported the team's daily progress, while the people of Nome lived in growing tension, watching the sick children worsen by the day. When Gunnar and Balto took over the final stage of the relay, the serum had already traveled hundreds of kilometers, passing from hand to hand. But the worst was yet to come. The final stage was the most treacherous, crossing gorges, frozen rivers, and snowfields where trails were invisible. Balto seemed to understand the importance of the mission. When Gunnar secured the metal cylinder to the sled and gave the command, the husky moved forward with a determination that impressed even the other dogs. Little did they know they were about to face the most brutal storm of their lives. As Gunnar Kazan strapped the metal cylinder to the sled, the wind howled around him, whipping his face and freezing even the tears streaming from his eyes. He knew the weight of this stage rested squarely on his shoulders, and on Balto's paws and those of his team. The storm was relentless, covering the trail with a thick layer of fresh snow that made finding the path almost impossible. "Mush!" shouted Gunnar as Balto took the first step. The husky led the team with firm and calculated strides. It was as if Balto could feel the hidden trail beneath the snow, guiding the team along an invisible path. Even Gunnar, an experienced musher, knew he couldn't rely on his own eyes. He was blinded by the storm, with snowflakes cutting his vision like tiny shards of glass. Early in the journey, they encountered their first major obstacle: the partially frozen Topkoke River. The ice was treacherous, with thin layers that could give way at any moment. Gunnar hesitated, staring at the dark water slowly flowing beneath the cracked ice. But Balto didn't hesitate. With careful steps, he began crossing, his paws testing the ice before each move. The other dogs followed him in formation, pulling the sled loaded with the serum and Gunnar. The ice creaked beneath them, a sound that made Gunnar hold his breath, bracing for the worst. Midway across, a gust of wind nearly toppled the sled. Gunnar lost his balance, falling onto the ice as the sled's ropes began to slip. For a moment, it seemed like all was lost. But Balto reacted swiftly. The husky gave a firm pull on the sled straps, dragging Gunnar and the rest of the team to the opposite bank. The ice finally broke behind them, but they were safe, for now. As they pressed on, the storm worsened. The wind blew so fiercely that Gunnar could barely hear his own thoughts. Each gust carried a cold so biting that he feared losing his fingers and toes to frostbite. He had to hunch over the sled, gripping it tightly as Balto continued forward. His fur coated in ice but showing no signs of giving up. "Balto, you can do this." "We can do this," Gunnar murmured, more to himself than to the dog. But the challenges were not just physical. Gunnar began to doubt his ability to keep going. The extreme cold and relentless exhaustion sapped his strength and clouded his mind. He knew that without Balto, he would have already been lost, or given up entirely. At times, he couldn't even see the path. He simply trusted that Balto knew where to step. The final stretch of the trail passed through a steep gorge, where accumulated snow on the slopes threatened to avalanche at any moment. It was a place where a single misstep could mean death for the entire team. Gunnar gave the command to slow down, but Balto maintained the pace, not out of disobedience, but as if he knew that stopping would mean they could never start again. Midway through, a loud rumble echoed. A small avalanche began sliding down the mountain, a wave of snow and ice hurtling toward the sled. Gunnar shouted for the dogs to run, and Balto responded instantly, pulling the team with all his strength. The other dogs hesitated for a moment, but Balto led with such conviction that they all followed, narrowly escaping as the snow buried the trail behind them. By this point, the cold had reached unimaginable levels. Gunnar's beard was completely frozen, his clothes stiff like armor made of ice, and he could barely feel his hands as he gripped the ropes. The dogs were also beginning to show signs of exhaustion, but Balto never slowed down. Gunnar began to hear the sound of his own teeth chattering, the cold seeping into his bones. He knew he couldn't stop, not even for a moment. Time was precious. Every minute lost meant lives in Nome that couldn't be saved. In a critical moment, an especially strong gust of wind hit the sled, tipping it over and scattering the supplies into the snow. Gunnar fell onto his back, feeling as though the ground beneath him was made of frozen iron. The cylinder containing the serum rolled away, nearly disappearing into the storm. Sensing the gravity of the situation, Balto ran toward the cylinder. Gunnar, trembling and barely able to stand, watched through tear-blurred eyes as Balto used his teeth to grab the sled ropes and pull it back to him. The husky then stood still, as if waiting for his musher to gather himself. That moment gave Gunnar the strength he needed. He secured the cylinder once again, murmuring, "Thank you, boy. Thank you." The final kilometers were a combination of sheer physical effort and willpower. Gunnar could barely keep his eyes open, but Balto kept moving forward, as if he knew the destination was near. When they finally saw the faint lights of Nome in the distance, Gunnar let out a cry of relief. But Balto didn't stop. He led the group to the center of the town, halting only when they reached the clinic, where the doctor and his team were waiting. Gunnar untied the cylinder with trembling hands and delivered the serum intact. Balto, though exhausted, stood firm, as if he knew his mission was accomplished. The last 80 kilometers were the hardest. Gunnar, weary and with frozen hands, relied entirely on Balto. He could barely see, but the husky kept advancing, head low against the wind and paws sinking into the soft snow. At one point, the sled reached a steep slope that Balto needed to descend with the weight of the other dogs and the serum. Gunnar tried to use the brake, but it broke on impact, and the sled began sliding rapidly. Balto took control, adjusting his body weight and guiding the team to avoid a deadly collision. Finally, after 20 hours without rest, they spotted the first lights of Nome. Gunnar let out a hoarse cry of relief, but Balto didn't slow down. Only when they reached the clinic, with the serum intact, did the dog stop, panting but still standing. Gunnar untied the sled with trembling hands and handed the serum to the doctor, who immediately began preparing the doses. When the children started receiving the serum, the doctors realized they had arrived at the last possible moment. The epidemic was contained, and the lives of dozens of children were saved. Gunnar was hailed as a hero, but he knew the true savior was Balto. The story of the serum run spread across the world, and Balto became a symbol of courage, loyalty, and resilience. In New York City, a statue was erected in his honor in Central Park, where it still stands today. The words engraved on its base say it all: endurance, fidelity, intelligence. Balto's story is a reminder that heroes come in all shapes and sizes. In the face of the harshest cold, with lives at stake, a dog and his musher showed that courage and determination can overcome even the most impossible challenges. Today, Balto is remembered as one of history's greatest heroes, a husky who braved a storm and won a race against time to save a town on the brink of destruction. Sometimes, the greatest heroes walk on four paws.